opportunity to be able to talk about a favorite subject of mine, Ignatian spirituality. But I always feel like I ought to begin a presentation like this with something of a disclaimer, you see. I consider myself new to this business of spirituality. So if it sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about tonight, that's why. Yes, I'm a Jesuit. I've been a Jesuit now for some 40 years. And I certainly have drunk the Kool-Aid. I've been steeped in Jesuit spirituality. All of us are, we Jesuits. But sort of like the air we breathe, we don't take time to advert to it, to articulate it, to sort of step out of it and study it from a distance, and certainly he talks about it. As Michael said, I practiced as an architect, and I was involved in church renovation. And my interest was in the liturgy. That's what motivated my interest in architecture. After 12 years of doing that, I got pulled in by the Society of Jesus to do administration. I worked in the provincial's office, and then I think it was for my good behavior, I got sent to Buffalo to be superior of the Jesuit community here. Now that role is more than about seeing to the house and the welfare of the men in the community. It sort of requires that I keep an eye on the apostolic works that are within my purview. And I found that there was and continues to be a need in this area, for this geographical area, in Buffalo and Western New York, for spiritual directors, for programs in spirituality. And I had no pretensions of meeting this need by myself, but luckily people came forward, people who were really expertise in this area. And we've been collaborating out of Loyola Hall on the Ignatius College campus. But I knew that if I were to be instrumental in meeting this need, I had to take up the business of spirituality and spiritual direction myself, and be serious about it, you know? Go all in. So, well, here goes. St. Ignatius of Loyola, you heard him, right? Founder of the Jesuits. He gave the church a great gift, besides the Jesuits, of course. We call it the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Although the exercises, as we have come to call them for short, were never really lost to us, they were rediscovered after the Second Vatican Council, when the Council charged the religious orders to go back to our founders, to our seminal documents, and to the essence of our charisms. You've heard of the spiritual exercises? Yes? Has anyone done them? Okay, a few. So this will be a review for some. You can read the text of the spiritual exercises, but they're not really meant to be read. Ignatius was not an eloquent writer. It's hardly inspirational reading if you've ever tried to read them. The book is more a manual for a director, one who gives the spiritual exercises. And the exercises is sort of a retreat experience. Jesuits engage in this retreat twice, at least twice, during our lives. First time is as a novice, in the first year entering the order. And the second time only varies, but it's on the average 15 years later, at the end of our, well, rather protracted formation process, before we take final vows in the Society of Jesus. So I've done the spiritual exercises twice. But the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius are not meant just for Jesuits. They are meant for anyone who is resolved to go through them. And there are basically two ways of doing this retreat. One is to take approximately a month away, like in a retreat house, to maintain silence for pretty much the duration of that month. remove from the usual routines of one life, and to follow this program of prayer that Ignatius sets out. And this is how we Jesuits tend to do them. But most people who do them don't really have this opportunity, this luxury, to do the exercises, like taking a month away from their lives. Most people do them by devoting an hour to an hour and a half to them each day for about 8 to 9 months. Right now we have about 10 people doing them in the area. You really can't do these exercises by yourself. You need someone qualified to lead you through them. Because the exercises are a series of meditations, and someone has to introduce you to them, to the text of them, to the material, so that you can then go off and spend your time in meditation. But no more, you need someone to talk to about the experience of your meditation, your prayer. You need to have someone who understands the way of the exercise, the dynamics of it, to tell you what it is and help you realize what it is that's going on in your prayer as you go through these exercises. I guess it sounds a little bit like what you do with your shrink, huh? At least the model sounds the same.
But I assure you, before there was the business of psychotherapy, there were the great spiritual guides of our tradition. Before there was Freud, there was St. Ignatius of Loyola. Now let's be clear, there's a difference
between psychology and spirituality. They're pretty distinct. And the one who leads you in the spiritual exercises, the one who does spiritual direction, had better know that difference. Now, the experience of the spiritual exercises is divided into 4 weeks, which are really not strictly weeks, but more or less weeks, if you take that month to do them. So we refer to these 4 divisions of the exercises as weeks. And the first week is about God's mercy and God's intentions for the world and perhaps for you. The second is ostensibly about the life of Christ, but really it's about you forging a relationship with Jesus. The third week is about the passion and death of Jesus. And finally, the fourth week, again, is about the love of God, the mercy of God, alive in the world and in our lives. But what the exercises are, at their very core, is an encounter with the living God through his Son, Jesus. And it's based on some principles that, while not really new, I think were sort of newly discovered, newly articulated by Ignatius. And this got him into trouble. What are these principles? Well, here's what I think they are. First, that God is active in the world, and in our lives, and in the particulars of our lives. 2, that we can know the will of God for our lives, even in the particulars of our lives. 3, that God deals directly with the soul, yours and mine. 4, that while some people are endowed with extraordinary spiritual gifts of mystical prayer, everyone has the ability to be a mystic. Everyone has the ability to be a mystic. Let me put this another way. Anyone can be in relationship with God directly, because God deals directly with the individual soul. Well, why did this get Ignatius in trouble with the likes of, you guessed it, the Inquisition? This was Spain, after all. Because at the time, there were folks claiming to have direct contact with God, and they said they didn't need the mediation of the church. They claimed to have these mystical experiences of God, direct experiences of God, and were given divine knowledge, illuminations that exceeded and transcended revelation itself. Well, needless to say, the church was very suspicious about this sort of thing. But you see, Ignatius was very much a man of the church. He laid bare all that he was doing before church authorities and demanded a judgment from them. Was what he was doing right or wrong? In keeping with the church or not? If he was wrong, he would cease and desist. If he was right, he would surely keep going, doing what he was doing. So convinced was he that this was from God himself. And where did he get this conviction from? From his own experience during his conversion. And perhaps you know that famous story, huh? He was a man of the world, a courtier, a Basque, but very much the Spanish hidalgo, a ladies' man who would prove himself in the field of battle. Well, it just so happened that the French were marching on Pamplona. Ignatius and his men there at the fort were badly outnumbered. But Ignatius got it into his head that he would defend that fort to the end, rather than suffer defeat. Well, defeat he suffered in a big way. In fact, this year, 500 years ago, he had his leg blown out from under him by a cannonball. And he was carried back to his castle at Loyola to recover. And the story of setting and then resetting that leg is gruesome to tell. But so began that journey of his, coming to know the Lord. Well, in that castle, there wasn't much for entertainment during his convalescence. No Netflix, don't you know? Just 2 books. The life of Christ and the lives of the saints. He gave himself to reading these, and then to daydreaming. He spent time thinking about the life of Jesus, the lives of the saints, and then he spent time thinking of life when he would recover out of his sick bed, again pursuing the lady of his dreams and glory in macho encounters in battle. And he realized that this daydreaming caused movements of what we might call the affections. Both were pleasant while they lasted, but the pleasures of the daydreaming of romance, personal glory, did not last. It was fleeting. When it was all over, he felt empty. The pleasant affections that accompanied his daydream about the Lord and the saints and all that they had done, that lasted beyond the daydream. Something was going on within him. He said later it was like God was teaching him, as a master teaches a student. God was exercising influence over his very soul. And so it began. Ignatius did recover, and he lived badly for the rest of his life. But he did not return to life in court, the swaggering, the ladies, and he left his sword and his armor at the feet of a statue, Our Lady of Montserrat, a little shrine. And he put on the garb of a beggar, a pilgrim, and retreated to the monastery of Manresa, and spent a lot of time in a cave, well, really under the outcrop of rock, and spent time on this interior journey of conversion, where God, he said, taught his soul. Learn what was happening to his soul. More specifically, Ignatius had to learn of all that was going on within him, what was from God and what was from someplace else. The dark side, the devil. Ignatius didn't have the benefit of our knowledge of psychology. For him, the battle over the soul was waged by God against the devil. For Ignatius, the battle over the world was waged by God against the devil. And you and I, in this battle, must declare ourselves for God or for evil. I'm afraid it all sounds terribly simplistic and naive, but not so, because Ignatius knew from his own experience the lure of the evil one, and how attractive and deceptive that dark spirit can be. It can even appear, he says, as the angel of light. Very attractive. At the same time, Ignatius knew how gently and carefully God moves the soul and beckons us through his Son, the poor and humble Jesus. But the remarkable thing is, this is not pie-in-the-sky piety. Ignatius was a very practical man. And he was convinced that God is active in the world, and God's will for the world and for you and me, in the particular, in the real, in the moment, is accessible to us. And how do we come to this? How do we come to know of this and learn of this? Well, by the same kind of discernment that Ignatius came to learning during his own conversion. When certain daydreaming was pleasant while it lasted but fleeting and then left him empty, while other kinds of daydreaming was pleasant and continued to be pleasant and felt somehow fulfilling. That some activity within his soul left him feeling consoled and feeling like God was near, and other activities within his soul left him uneasy or agitated or out of sorts, even to the point where he wanted to take his own life. So terrible were those moments for him. He knew that one had to be from God, and the other surely was not from God. So far, so good? What I'd like to give you is a sense of this experience, these affections, this consolation or desolation, through an experience of prayer that Ignatius advocates in his exercises. Am I carrying? Yes. I'd like to guide you through a meditation, something akin to what one might do while one is doing the exercises. This is meant to engage your imagination and to draw you, hopefully, even tonight, here, into something of an encounter with Jesus. This isn't going to be magic, it's not going to be some ecstatic experience. But it calls us to use the facility of our minds, our imaginations, and our hearts to perhaps learn something of the ways of our hearts, and perhaps to learn something of the ways of God. Mind and heart, not just what you're thinking about, but also what you're feeling, the full experience. Be a little like watching a movie, more art than science, but it will happen within. So we're going to take some time to silence our minds, our hearts, to make them available to God. We do this through certain discipline, devoting time and space, and our physical selves, our mental selves, to God. I want to read from the scriptures, from the life of Jesus, one of his miracles. Listen to it. Then I'm going to read it again, but growing more deeply into the story. But first we begin in silence. More of our desire for God, to know Jesus. We call upon the Spirit to be with us. We are aware of our needs, our desires, and God's desire for us. Sit straight, feel not rigid, be comfortable, your feet on the floor perhaps. Close your eyes if you're comfortable doing that. Be aware of your breathing. Be aware that this is a sacred space. Be aware of the space around you. Immerse yourself in the silence. Rest there. I want to see. Be on your way, he says. Your faith is healed. Now slowly, gently, come out of your prayer. You might understand, roll your shoulders, move your head from side to side, but don't talk. Now take that card and that pencil. And recall what you just experienced. What comes to your mind? What comes to your mind straight up? A feeling? A word? Where were you in that story? Were there strong images? Strong words? Write them down. This is just for you. This is your little souvenir from tonight, this writing that you're doing. But what it does for you, how you write it down, is it creates a memory. It gives this experience sort of an objectivity, in a space, in a place, and time. You can kind of carry it with you. Now, if you were on retreat doing the spiritual exercises, you would be writing down what goes on in your prayers you've just been doing in a journal. And this would be the material for conversation with your spiritual director. And together you would be discerning what it is that God is doing within you during your prayer. Is this from God? Was it from some other place? What does this recall, these feelings, these memories, what do they mean? Where is God working in all of us? Needless to say, it's going to get very personal. So you have to trust your spiritual director. One can become quite vulnerable during prayer like this. Issues come up from one's life, both good and unsettling, and you have to deal with this. Sometimes these become distractions to your prayer, but sometimes it's the Spirit telling you that this is where you, as an individual in your life, need perhaps to spend some more time. You see, this reflection on prayer, this discernment, is key to Ignatian spirituality, because it begins to tell us what it is we are to do in our lives. It's the way to discern the very will of God for ourselves. But we need to practice this sort of thing, to be aware of it, to take our feelings and these affections seriously. This is how Ignatius was sure God speaks to us, touches our hearts, teaches us. Yes, through our thinking, our rational side, but also by way of these interior movements. Yeah? Anybody want to volunteer a word or two of reflection on what they've just experienced? You don't have to get too personal, but a word. Anybody? Yeah. Goosebumps. Good goosebumps and bad goosebumps. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I felt that I was left with the feeling that the answers are within me and that God is
That the answers were within, and God was assisting in the answering of whatever it is you're going to do. Yes.
Here.
I'm sorry?
Here.
Tears. Tears. Thank you, yeah. Ignatius thought that tears in prayer were from God often. They were consolation. They so affected the affections. This was God. So we got three responses. You heard them. Think about what you heard. What did that do for you? The answers were inside you, and God is letting you discover them. Tears. Goosebumps. Think about what that means to you as you hear those. Did that correspond to your prayer? Let me go back to my script, otherwise we're going to get completely lost. Yes. So now we can use as the basis of our prayer questions and issues that are important to us. And we've just used the text for our prayer from Scripture. And much of the exercises of St. Ignatius, at least in the practice, are doing these kinds of meditations from Scripture. But often people do come to the spiritual exercises because they're at a turning point in their life. And they have a major decision to make. For Jesuits, we do it the first time in that first year of our novitiate to once again face that decisive moment. Do I want to be a Jesuit or don't I? Is this life for me or is it not? But whatever the decision or the issue is, the text for the prayer becomes the question itself, or the issue itself, or the desire itself. And Ignatius gives us exercises for making a decision in prayer. Ways about praying our way through the process of making a decision. I won't give you the full rundown because we simply don't have time for it, but some of these are pretty commonsensical. In prayer, then, list the pros and cons of the decision you're about to make. Take a look at them. What do they look like? But do it in prayer. Or imagine that you're someone else, not you, and you are advising someone like you who's dealing with the same thing, having to make the same decision. what would you say? Or, imagine you're on your deathbed. Which would you be glad you did when your life was at its end? Use your imagination. But you do this kind of thing in prayer before God. And you have to ask God, Ignatius was clear on this, you have to ask God to reveal God's self and his will to you. And then after you have prayed, you reflect on that experience. Where were you consoled? Where did you feel that God was near and affirming you? Or did you feel something else? The opposite. Did God seem distant, not affirming? Were you anxious or angry or unsettled? Now there are three things, at least, that are required here to make a decision like this in this process of prayer. First, you have to have done prayer like this to know and to be practiced at reading those interior movements. You have to be able to identify them and articulate them and discuss them. And you have to do this in prayer. You have to begin by asking God for the grace to help you through this process. You have to ask for the desire to know God's will and to do God's will. And the third thing is kind of tricky. Ignatius calls it indifference. You have to reach a point of indifference. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you don't care. Chances are you like all the choices that are before you. Chances are it's not a choice between something good and something bad. If that were the choice, well, we're moral people. We would want to choose the good. But often it's between something that's good and something else that's good. Which of these does God want you to do? That's the indifference. Being able to surrender to God, to his will. Lord, I want to do what you want. What is it I am to do? Good enough? So far, so good? You're following the process here. What have we looked at? Well, we've looked at a method of prayer that evokes these feelings and these affections. And we've talked about discerning these affections, these spirits, in order to discern what is from God and what is not from God. What God might be asking of me, and what's my own private, selfish agenda. In major decisions of our lives, and sometimes even too in the small things. We've made some pretty bold assumptions that God directs the soul, and that we have access to what this is by reading these affections. But this isn't a quick and easy method. It takes time, it takes silence, discipline, and indifference. It's not like getting an email from God, is it? And whatever comes of this process, then, whatever decision we come to in this process, there's one more important step. We have to test it. We have to test it against reality. We have to test it against church teaching. For Jesuits, we have to test it against our vow of obedience. I may discern, but my superior decides, right? But here's the thing. We can discern and decide issues that we face together. And I think this is the relevance for us today, tonight, as we look toward church on fire. We as a church are at a critical moment. To quote our Pope Francis, we're not in an era of change. We are in a change of eras. We are at a moment of radical change. Just look at the world around us. Huh? Technology, moving at breakneck speed, changing the world, our planet, the conditioning. And oh yeah, COVID, 2 years ago, has changed us. And then there's Buffalo, the Church of Buffalo, hobbled by scandal, demoralized, chapter 11, and us. Where's the Spirit in all this? What is God calling us to do? How do we discern the will of God? How the Spirit may be calling us? And how do we do this together? Because this is our project. Well, what we have outlined for the individual can be done in a group too, I think. It's a similar way, a similar practice. Let me tell you about it. What we did together tonight is a good start. That's scriptural meditation. What we could have done, if we had the time and the interest in doing so, is we could have broken up into small groups, like 5 in a group or 6, and had conversation. What we call spiritual conversation. Each person would have had the opportunity to say briefly what happened in his or her own prayer to that small group. Now, this is not quite faith sharing as we know it, and as we are used to doing. This is much more focused than that. What were the movements of the Spirit within you during that moment of prayer? That's the issue for the conversation. And this kind of conversation requires 2 things. One, that each person who speaks stays on point. What it is he or she needs to say. What happened during my prayer? And that each of the others, while that person is speaking, is listening attentively to what the others are saying. Go around that circle, and each person speaks, and all others are listening. And being aware of what each person says, how that affects me, how what that person is saying is moving those affections within me. Because then after that first round of sharing, the next question is, what stirs you as you listen? And you'll reflect on that. You reflect on what you hear. And then you have to listen. What's emerging from what's being said? What's coming to the fore? But you see, this process isn't about thinking through problems or persuading each other in this group or arguing a point. It's merely about what's happening. What's happening in the prayer, what's happening in the Spirit, what's happening through these movements of the Spirit. And a group must practice this kind of praying. And we do this through the Scriptures, as we just did this evening. And when we do this more often, we learn to trust each other. And we learn to discern what we're hearing. And after a group has practiced this and trust each other, know what the Spirit, how that Spirit feels, then we can tackle decisions. But to do that, one needs the right players too. One needs to have the people who are involved in the decision-making process. And one needs data. Right? What's involved? What are the implications of our various choices? That kind of research needs to be done. That kind of conversation needs to go on. But then the individuals pray, individually, over these things, as we just did over that gospel passage. We deliberate privately, but before God, asking for God's guidance. One has to enter into the silence, make space, and listen. And the Spirit speaks to us.
but in silence. And then the group comes together for that group discernment. And then finally, when a decision, if a decision comes to the fore, it must be tested against reality. We seek affirmation for our decisions in the lived experience, in further reflection then, in discernment and prayer. Okay, I've given you a lot tonight. I'm trying to describe a method that you really need to experience. And what you need through that experience is, I'm afraid, a director. One who can teach the method of this prayer. And if you're doing this in a group, to keep the group on track. And to be able to read the group. Preferably this director has no stake in the decision if there's a decision to be made. And of course what it calls for all participants, is this indifference, and that's the hard part. You can't go into this process with a preconceived notion of the outcome or the decision already made in your back pocket. It doesn't work that way. You have to be open to the way the Spirit might be leading. Now, is this kind of a newfangled thing, a group dynamic kind of thing? Well, it's a group dynamic sort of thing, but I think it goes way back. I think it goes back to the earliest church. Read the Acts of the Apostles. Those early Christians had to make decisions how to live as Christians in a pagan world. I think they were about this kind of prayer and this kind of discernment. You know, in 1540, Ignatius of Loyola had gathered around himself what we've come to call the First Companions, the Jesuits soon to be. They were a handful of men who had done these exercises and knew this kind of prayer. They were men well educated. They taught the faith in the streets, to kids. They cared for the sick and the poor in the streets. They wondered if they should just continue as they were, individuals doing good work, or should they actually form a religious order? They wondered if they should just be separate men as they were, or band together. Now, to become a religious order, especially in those days, was not easy. It certainly required a papal affirmation, and that was not easy to come by. And in those days, there were many influential churchmen who thought that the church had quite enough of these religious orders, thank you very much. The church did not need something new like Ignatius was proposing. Now, these first companions were in Venice at the time, and they were trying to figure this out. But they did this kind of group discernment, and they concluded that yes, they would band together to become a religious order. But then they had to test that decision against reality. This would require a trip to Rome, and would require the approval of the Pope. And there was doubt that that would happen. But it did happen. And the rest is history. Now, our Pope Francis, is calling our church to be a discerning church. That's the word he uses. I think this is what he's talking about. Remember, he's a Jesuit. He's well schooled in this stuff. I think this is what's behind his synod on synodality. He's calling the people of God, I think, to this kind of prayer, this kind of meditation, this kind of silence, this kind of shared prayer, and I think to group discernment. You know, a lot of people are scratching their heads. What does it mean? What is this Pope calling us to with this synodality stuff? Sure, it has to do with listening to each other, listening to the laity. We've heard that. But what might be the method by which we do this? Well, I think this is one way. This is a method. This is a meditative practice, engaging in this kind of spiritual conversation, arriving at decisions prayerfully, and beginning with that indifference that opens us up to the Spirit, to wherever the Spirit is calling us. I think this Ignatian spirituality is time before us. For the church, for Buffalo, for our parishes. I think this would be a method to guide us through our diocesan renewal. But it takes time. Silence, prayer, reflection, discipline, and freedom. Freedom to be open to the Spirit. And a willingness to listen. Thank you. I've got 5 minutes past 8. Any questions for me? Because you know,
Any suggestions for books?
Any suggestions for books? Yeah. You might have heard of Father James Martin. James Martin, that's the evening from the Vatican. He wrote a number of things. He's got one book called something like Everything You Want to Know About Jesuits or Afraid to Ask. It's called something like, I think you know the name of that book? The Guide to Everything Jesuit. Yeah. There's another Jesuit, Mark Thibodeau, T-H-I-B, well, you know. He's written some nice things that are very accessible on this kind of prayer. Some of it gets pretty heavy, but those two are pretty good. They're very accessible. Yes, sir.
Yes, you talked about how the companions with St. Ignatius were working among the poor. And in this lecture series, we've heard from some other members of religious orders about, their unique history. And we learned, that the Vincentians, St. Vincent started early on working among the poor, and his religious order began working among the poor. In the last lecture, we heard about the Franciscans and how St. Francis started working early among the poor, outside the city walls, and he had a number of people who started following him and working with him among the poor. So it makes me wonder if whatever approach we take to church reform, or whatever methods, it always seems to go back to serving the poor. And maybe for the church to reform, it needs to go back to its earliest roots, working among the poor as Christianity spread through sort of a lower class, that the Roman Empire was sort of built upon. And maybe we need to go back to that in order to sort of find our way forward.
The question was, or the comment was, Ignatius was really continuing to work among the poor, and working among the poor seems to be what religious orders do. I guess the Jesuits have this reputation of having both an elite in education, and yes, we do, but working with the poor is always a piece of what we're doing. As novices, we get sent to work with the poor. We get sent to work with the dying, just for the sake of that experience. And when we do this, we come back to our bishop, to our homes, and reflect on it. We reflect on it together. And that kind of dynamic that we were talking about. Yeah. So yes, and it's very interesting. This leads me to my next question. Have I ever done this? Our Father General, so he's the top dog in the Society of Jesus of the World. He has exhorted all the Jesuits around the world to take 2 days to do this kind of prayer, reflection, and shared conversation, spiritual conversation, on our vow of poverty, what it means to us, how we live it, say, it was an extraordinary experience. And this sort of thing does all kinds of things for us. You see, it brings us together. It builds trust. It builds trust that the Spirit is working on us. And what emerged out of our 2 days together was really quite remarkable. What our Father means, how it protects us. It protects us against ambition, careers, being too comfortable. But always know, if you need to get fixed, work on it. The kingdom belongs to the Lord. Yeah, thank you for that. Yes?
Do you have a recommendation for those seeking spiritual direction from a Jesuit?
Yeah, my card. We're working on that. As I indicated early, there's a real dearth in the area, and we're working on programs for that. Right up Loyola Hall, this past summer we did a workshop, a 5-day workshop on Ignatian spirituality. Of that group, so we had about 26. 10 came forward and said they were interested in doing the spiritual exercises. Now these folks are working people; they can't take a month off of vacation. So they're doing the 19 meditation, that long practice. These people are getting an hour and a half each morning to the exercises. They see a director once a week, and we're hoping then this next summer to do a follow-up to train people to give those exercises. You don't need to be a Jesuit to give those exercises, just as you don't have to be a Jesuit to do them. So we're working on that. But if you're really interested in that, let me know, and we'll try to arrange something for you. John?
What you did tonight seems very similar to Lexio Divina.
Yes, it is. And Lexio Divina, so do you know Lexio Divina is a way of reading Scripture slowly and just savoring it? Certainly, and that's one of the ways in which Ignatius advocates we pray. But as you do that again, there's a movement of the Spirit. You take one of those psalms, and sometimes they speak so deeply to you, and that you may know. Some of those songs cry out for help, and all of a sudden you realize that's where your heart is. What's going on? Yes. Yes, ma'am. Sure. Hold on. Yep. So this gentleman says he's doing that long retreat. It takes about 5 months. So he's doing it. He's doing it at St. Michael's. They have a program too. Okay. But he makes the comment that the group that is doing this, they're doing it more or less together. I mean, it's an individual journey, but you sort of share the races, as they say. And what it does for the group, they came as strangers. And now there's an affinity, there's a
One other thing, when we were doing sharing, telling each other about the past week, we were all talking about the same thing.
yes, yes. And so you see how when you're in that group dynamic, things begin to surface, a common grace. Yeah. Very good. Unpaid advertisement. Any questions? No. Anybody else? Yes. are used today. Right. And so you really immerse yourself in the story. And it's not about trying to recover the historical Jesus. It's about meeting Jesus in that story.
Well, there's one scene in which Jesus is standing at a fire cooking breakfast for his disciples, and he gets you into that which you can smell the wood.
Yes.
And you can sit at the feet of Jesus.
Ignatius calls that the application of the senses, where you immerse yourself in that story, you see it, you hear Jesus' voice, you smell the smoke, you feel the sand, yeah. But again, it's the encounter with Jesus, the Lord, the living Lord, not this historical person. And that's what that experience is about. Thank you. Anything else? Shall we call it a night?
Yes, it is. We are about to conclude. On behalf of the Parish Council, we would like to present the Giclée reproduction of the Church on Fire painting, The Burning of Notre Dame. And hopefully, when you see that, you'll think of this evening and remember it. Thank you, Father.
You're welcome.
There's also $50 in each person